the way to stop this is the first question anyone should ask, whether they're a doctor, a nurse, a manager, or whoever, is what I'm doing, I'm saying, the best thing for patient safety and patient interest, rather than is this the best thing to meeting my targets or my performance record or whatever. I think people need to weigh up the differences between a statutory inquiry and a non-statutory inquiry. I admit Stat actually did both, and it started off with a non-statutory inquiry, and then I recommended there should be a further inquiry, which the government decided should be a statutory one. So I have a bit of experience of both. The thing about a non-statutory inquiry is you can get things done much more quickly. If I may put this politely to my colleagues, not so hidebound by lawyers telling you what to do. You can go and see people and talk to them informally. You can gather a lot of information very quickly. You can sit in public. Mine, I didn't, for that part of the inquiry, but there's no reason why such an inquiry cannot sit in public or have public sessions. So those are the advantages. The disadvantages are that you cannot compel people to come and give evidence or give you documents. And that could be a problem in a case like this, because there will be people who no longer work for the NHS who might be reluctant for all sorts of reasons to be candid with an inquiry, particularly, if I may say so, if they're being threatened with prosecution for corporate manslaughter or something like that.
Well, isn't that the critical point, though, that you do need to be able to compel for that reason, don't you? Because the potential for people not wanting to be frank about their own complicity in this is huge, is presumably very high. Is that what you found out with mid-staffs? Is that why it went from a non-public?
Can I just add at this point, you're right to some extent, but of course everyone has a right not to incriminate themselves, and that actually means that if they're asked questions about what they did at this particular case, or indeed any other, they can say, "I'm not prepared to talk about that because it might incriminate me." So the fact that someone is compelled to come along doesn't necessarily mean they will actually give the evidence you want to hear. But there's no doubt there are some advantages to statutory inquiries other than that. There is a formality about it. Evidence is given on oath, but they do take a very long time. I mean, there are a number of public inquiries going on at the moment into serious issues, which have been going on literally for years. So I'm not saying it should be ruled out at all, but what I have suggested is that in the context of what hasn't currently been announced, a chair should be appointed to consult with the interested parties, to consult with the tragic families that have been involved in this, to find out what they want. And you may find there's not one united voice about this. So I would ask them what they feel they want and why they want it, and indeed other people. I think there could be a consultation about what the terms of reference are, because there's a temptation to try and inquire into everything at an inquiry like this, which of course is one reason why they tend to go on for a long time. So, or you could decide to do things in stages, to start off with a non-statutory inquiry about things that are relatively easy to inquire into, and then move on to the more difficult and challenging things. Because I do think one of the points is that there are lessons undoubtedly to be learned from this awful tragedy and terrible event, but they need to be learned quickly. And we don't want to know the answers in 5 years' time. We want to know them as soon as possible.
How useful is this concept of criminal negligence or corporate manslaughter when it comes to people who ignored the warnings? Is that something? Is that a red herring? Is that a useful thing for to be considered, do you feel?
Well, I don't think it's a red herring, and if criminal offences can be proved, then clearly they should be considered. But there is a difficulty about threatening people with prosecution in that one of the things everyone says, and I have all promoted, but first of all really promoted it, is we need candour and openness and transparency. And unfortunately, if you prosecute people for or threaten to prosecute people for errors of judgment, even very serious errors of judgment, you will not get a culture of openness, because for the reasons I've just mentioned, people who are under threat of prosecution are likely to clam up and be entitled to.
Let's talk about that culture of openness. Do you think the NHS is institutionally resistant to whistleblowers? You've had experience of looking really into the workings of the system. Do you think there's a resistance to whistleblowing within that system?
If you read and listen to the words spoken by NHS leaders, both at the top and throughout the system, you would say there wasn't, because they all sign up to candour, to openness and transparency. But I'm afraid when there is the pressure comes on, when real life hits the rails, as it were, hits the road, human reaction can be, and wrongly, to cover things up. It's a stupid thing to do, because particularly these days, it never works. It only causes more harm than good. But it's a normal human reaction from school kids onwards. You know, you've done something wrong, you try and hide it. And but I think so. In that sense, there is an institutional reluctance to do this. There is too much priority given to reputation management as opposed to patient safety. I believe, and the way to stop this is the first question anyone should ask, whether they're a doctor, a nurse, a manager, or whoever, is what I'm doing, I'm saying, the best thing for patient safety and patient interest, rather than is this the best thing to meeting my targets or my performance record or whatever.
And should managers be therefore regulated in the same way as doctors and nurses, because they have a certain responsibilities to patient safety, which presumably managers with one eye on PR and reputations and penny pinching don't have?
Yeah, well, I think this is an issue that should now be looked into, and probably by this inquiry yet again. I mean, I recommended that it should be considered, but only after putting in place a better and stronger fit and proper person test. That was some years ago. For reasons we could discuss forever, I don't now think the fit and proper person test, as it is now administered, is the answer, because I don't think it has worked. And I think something more robust is required. And I do think that there is not a level playing field between managers and everyone else who sit around the table when it comes to professional jeopardy, if you like.
Yeah. Is the overstretching of the NHS, does that make a problem worse like this, in terms of how they respond to someone making a complaint, someone pointing out a possible issue within a department? Do you think the NHS overworked, overstretched, makes it almost more likely that problems like this will occur?
Well, well, perhaps going to exaggerate this, but I find it difficult to see that pressures such as short staffing, money pressures, all the things that managers are needed for to deal with in a health service, complicated disease, must mean that they have less time to reflect on things, and their priority clearly is to get the service working, to get work done. And so when someone comes along with a concern which is likely to interfere with the relations with the nursing and the doctors, for instance, not this case particularly, but it could be this case, there may be an immediate reaction over, please don't get in the way, we've got patients to treat. So they think they're doing the best for their patients, but you know, you've just got to think about whether something is safe. They need to start thinking more about the risk to patients as opposed to whether a particular fault can be proved. I mean, if you mid-staffs, there are excessive mortalities according to the statistics, but instead of looking into them and reviewing cases, they questioned the statistical method and got an academic study done about that. Yeah. And so that's the sort of reaction that happens. And that happens when you put organizations under pressure. You give them targets which are career ending if you don't meet them. And human nature kicks in, really.